Now, one of the things that I'd like to point out, I'm sorry, today's class is meant for a discussion on how philosophy underwent a paradigm shift during the Enlightenment. That is to say, what were the new philosophical directions that the Enlightenment sought out for itself? And I will also be asking the question as to whether this was a monologic discourse of reason that the Enlightenment sort of perpetrated, or were there other voices as well? So fundamentally, what I'm trying to look at are the constituent elements and the direction shifts in terms of the Enlightenment's philosophy. I will also remind you that in my earlier discussion, I had mentioned that the Enlightenment was a pan-European phenomenon. So it was not that philosophy came from one or two sources, but it was dispersed across the continent. This is something we need to always keep at the back of our mind. Now, the most major shift that we locate during the Enlightenment is, of course, the shift towards rationality. Now, I had mentioned that, you see, primarily, if you look at the philosophers of the Middle Ages, their philosophy was based on a belief in God. This involved miracles. This involved a process of thought that gave a lot of space to the extra-rational, that was beyond rationality, because God was not defined in terms of rationality, but in terms of faith. Now, therefore, the Enlightenment had this dilemma also. What would happen to God once human reason came in? So this is a major issue that the Enlightenment faced. Also, one of the questions that was asked was, what were the limits of human rationality? See, what knowledge exactly could the human rationale figure out? In between, of course, as I pointed out, between the Middle Ages and the Enlightenment, we have the Renaissance, which talked about the fashioning of the human self. And this is very interesting in the sense that, after all, the Enlightenment was equally talking about, or it was equally concerned about, the question of human nature. What was human nature like? Was it beastly? Was it divine? Was it somewhere in between? And how could it be perfected? The entire idea of a literature of conduct, a literature of satire, for example, would be predicated upon the fact that human nature was something in formation and that it could be transformed, as it were, through the right method of knowledge and the right goal of knowledge, right? The Middle Ages, of course, considered this goal to be spiritual. What were the goals that the Enlightenment was setting up for itself is a question that the philosophers kept on asking. So rationality is one of the major paradigm shifts that the Enlightenment had. And of course, the figure who kind of prefigures the Enlightenment is the figure of Francis Bacon. Once again, Novum Organum, one of the first major experiments in natural philosophy, and the idea that human knowledge and human scientific, rational, empirical observation could lead to a certain amount of knowledge that was in itself sufficient for good living. Now, the philosopher who transformed the Enlightenment in many ways, although later on dismissed by both Newton and Locke, was René Descartes. Now, Descartes' Discourse and Method 1670 and Meditations published a little later both talked about the need to question. This was one of the first and fundamental aspects of the Enlightenment, its desire to question, and its idea that received knowledge was largely dogmatic and based on convention. Therefore, you needed to relentlessly question all received knowledge. This was Descartes' first principle. He said that whatever I see around me, I do not know whether they are correct or not, whether they at all exist or not. Therefore, his first principle was dubito, or doubt. And doubt, skepticism, questioning was the philosophical initiation into the pattern of thought. So how do I know? Now, you will, of course, remember that when you talk about the empirical basis, the word empirical, of course, leads towards knowledge, right? Experiential knowledge, right? And ontology is knowledge intuitively. Therefore, epistemology and ontology. Now, the empirical is therefore moving towards the questioning of how does one go about knowing. So what is the correct process? Descartes says that the correct process is that you first doubt, dubito. Then Descartes says, I doubt everything. And therefore, by extension, I doubt whether this, say, for example, this mobile phone exists. And I say this does not exist. But what exists is the fact that I think it exists, right? So my thought exists. And therefore, since my thought exists, I exist, right? So therefore, I exist because I think, right? Cogito ergo sum. I know, therefore I am, right? And this entire thesis of the cogito, I think, therefore I am, rather, sorry, that the human mind itself. So Descartes, what Descartes is saying is that physically whether this mobile phone exists, I don't know. Whether physically I exist, I don't know. But I exist in terms of my mind, and therefore I exist, right? So dubito et cogito ergo sum. I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am, right? And Descartes was therefore segregating the mind and the body and prefiguring or predicating the mind, prioritizing the mind, the thinking mind of man over the material human body. Now, when we read Descartes, we'll see how Descartes moves about this. And he says that, we will break every problem into its constituent parts. We will not think that anything is true until and unless it is proved in every circumstance without any exception, right? So this is the method, the charting of rationality, that everything has to be proved. Nothing can be, said to be true until and unless it is proved in every circumstance. And there is this Cartesian mind-body dualism, right, where the mind is the fundamental source of existence rather than the corporeal human body. Now, the problem, therefore, is, where is God here? And where do the ideas come from? Now, Descartes, of course, had the thesis of innate ideas. He said that we do not generate ideas, but the idea, we are born with them, and that we can only deduce this idea. So this is called a deductive rationality. So there are truths within our mind, and that we deduce them through the proper method. And who is the repository of all this truth? Is God, right? Therefore, Descartes sees no contradiction between the cogito and the divine. He rather suggests that God is this repository of all knowledge who has given us innate knowledge, and we can only deduce this rationality through various logical deductive methodologies while keeping on questioning and thinking. So Descartes becomes the philosopher who sets the cogito as the basis of human existence. Now, you see, many of you are probably thinking, what is so extraordinary? If you think deeply, at this point of time, religion had said that God exists, therefore man exists, according to the will of God. The other group had said man exists because his body exists. Calvin would consider human beings as animals fundamentally, therefore made of the senses. What Descartes is doing is he's saying question everything and just consider that you exist because you think. So human thought, human rationality is now becoming the cornerstone of his very being, right? And therefore, with Descartes, I would say, the story of our modernity begins, right? Now, of course, when you will see that Descartes is also the philosopher whom existentialists and the subsequent postmodern philosophers will question, right? Because Descartes leads to a certain degree of essence. He says, these are true, right? So this is proved. And therefore, we will take this as truth because nothing else is, there are no exceptions. And of course, you will have philosophers like Kierkegaard who will talk about, death as the only certitude. And there will be, of course, within the Enlightenment also, philosophers like Hume who will say, you cannot rationally arrive at knowledge. You have to arrive at it with sympathy and sensibility. That rationality can be wrong. Your knowledge process can be wrong. Kierkegaard would suggest that, the only thing that is true and that is that you will be dead. And of course, you will have later on postmodernists who will argue, how do you know what is true? Truth is always relative. Einstein will, of course, question it. So Descartes is the philosopher. Cartesianism is the philosophy to which every single philosopher of modernism will also return to, right? But Descartes is laying the course, I would say, for what our modernity thought was the basis of our empiricism. But Descartes' problem was that he suggested that, the mind and the body were linked basically through a gland, and the pineal gland is the gland that he talks about. And this mind-body dualism generated a lot of debate. Also important was the fact that, Descartes was not taking out God from the equation, neither was Newton for that matter. And the fourth problem of Descartes is that, this thesis of innate ideas, that you were born with ideas, which many of the Enlightenment philosophers were very distinctly uncomfortable with. So what happened to experience? Where did knowledge come from? If we did have all knowledge within us, therefore we could just arrive at it in terms of deduction, right? You see, for those of you who have an interest in detective fiction, the detective is always a deducer. Deductive rationality is you have a certain truth already established, who has committed the crime. The detective is moving at it through the method of Descartes and trying within his method. You see, Poirot, for example, talks about his method as arriving at the truth. Anyways, that's a different issue altogether. But, even rationality has its two parts, as it were. One is deductive, but there is the truth that you arrive at it, deduce it. And the other is the way which is called the inductive rationality, where from experience you gradually move towards a more complex level of truth. And the philosopher who brought in this question of inductive rationality was, of course, Locke. Now, Locke was the transformer, but between Descartes and Locke, between 1670 and 1690, I think the role played by Isaac Newton was, of course, very important. Newton we consider to be a scientist. We never really think of him as a philosopher. But Newton was the one who actually sort of brought in this element of experience and observation, right? So be it in the case of gravity or be it in the case of optics. Newton was looking at an experimental form of truth which was based on acute observation and therefore inductively framed, right? So because the apple was falling, therefore Newton said there is a force which is pulling us towards the center of the earth, and therefore comes the question of gravity. Now, this is taken to its logical conclusion by the philosopher John Locke. And Locke's thesis is, of course, the thesis of what we'll call empiricism, empirical rationality. What was Locke's first principle? Locke just took out Descartes' fundamental principle that all knowledge was innately given. He said there's nothing called innate knowledge. There's nothing we are born with. We are born with, you will remember the phrase that he used, a tabula rasa, a blank slate. So when we are born, we have no ideas within us. Therefore, the question is, how does one garner knowledge, gather knowledge? Locke says that this also involves a process. And the fundamental entity of knowledge is experience, sense experience. So Locke is suggesting, and this is the revolution, that there is no knowledge beyond sense experience. Now, Descartes had suggested that there is a duality between mind and matter. Locke is bringing mind and matter together and is saying that it's from the matter that the mind will come, right? You get a sense experience, then you have a primary idea. And he says that the process of knowledge is intensely complex, that you have from sense experience, you move towards primary knowledge, primary idea. And from primary idea, you have a series of secondary ideas, which are gradually more complex. And therefore, this can lead to knowledge. Consider the impact. I'll give you an example of how this happens also. But consider the impact of this thesis is that there is now no knowledge which is beyond man, right? Beyond human sensation. Now, what happens to God? There's no question of God involved here. Descartes was still keeping God within the mainframe of knowledge. Locke was just taking him out. He said everything depends on your senses. And there is no knowledge, as it were, which is beyond this sphere of sense experience. Now, obviously, therefore, the concept of a miracle or the concept of extra sensory perceptions all disappear, right? And therefore, there is experience, sense experience. There is simple ideas, primary ideas. Primary ideas are joined together into complex ideas, and they have to be joined logically. They cannot be randomly combined together, right? And therefore, they can together combine to form complex ideas. Complex ideas can lead us towards complex knowledge systems. And the final goal is all knowledge. Now, that in itself, let us give an example of that so that you understand it. This is something which I have talked to my students, but there are a lot of you who have joined in recently. You take a bottle of water, say this is a kettle of water. This is of course not, but you take a kettle of water and you start boiling it. The child, he dips his hand into boiling water. His hand is scalded, right? Gets burnt and immediately withdraws it. That is sense experience, the basic perception of getting scalded. That is sense experience. Now, what does this give him? This gives him the primary idea of heat, that something is hot. Heat is associated with hotness, that This is the primary idea of heat. Now he observes very carefully, and he sees that when the fire burns, there heat is produced, right? So, and when the fire burns, therefore the secondary idea is that of energy, fire energy being transformed into heat energy. And then he observes that due to that heat energy, the kettle top is popping at times, right? And that the steam is creating a force. Take it to its logical conclusion, and you will arrive at James Watt and the steam engine, right? So there, what am I looking at? What is Locke looking at? Locke is looking at sheer observation of the human phenomenon. And through the sheer observation of human phenomenon, cutting out God, cutting out miracles, and arriving at graded systems of knowledge from the simple idea to the complex combined ideas. Once again, logically combined, right? Because in Stern, when we do Tristram Shandy, we shall see that combining ideas randomly is very unlockian in that sense. It leads to madness. Randomness leads to madness. And therefore, Locke's thesis of language is also very clear that it is sequential, it is logical, and therefore it will provide us with a proper index of meaning, right? Language will be transparent. That, language has to transform or transfer that sense experience into understanding. This is the high empirical period. From Newton to Locke, you will see that till the 1700s, you have the high empirical period of the Enlightenment, where empiricism takes on a huge seat. Now, the other two philosophers that I would like to talk about, also to a certain extent, is, or rather are, Spinoza and also to a certain extent, Lebanese, right? Lebanese and Spinoza. Now, one of the things that I would suggest is that, when you read Spinoza, Spinoza suggests that, that this dualism, the Cartesian dualism, Spinoza's text is 1677, so it's writing immediately after Descartes. He suggests that this dualism between the mind and the body should be replaced by an ontological monologism, where he says that there is only one substance, God or nature, right? So God is nature itself. So he's fusing the mind and the matter into the one natural phenomenon, which is also divine, with two attributes corresponding to mind and body, right? Therefore, he denies any transcendental human being called God. He says that nature is God, right? And therefore, he identifies God with nature, gives strong impetus to the strands of atheism and naturalism, and therefore leads him to a strict determinism and to deny any role to final causes or teleology in explanation. So Spinoza's thesis will later on influence to a large extent both atheists and the naturalists, including later on probably Wordsworth, right? So Spinoza is cutting out the concept of a Cartesian dualism, the segregation of mind and matter, and saying there's only one monologic being, and that is God. And God is nature itself, right? Okay, so once again, this, as I mentioned yesterday, Christianity Not Mysterious, the treatise of the three impostors, where the Enlightenment is taking away, any religious mystical ulterior existence from the arena of philosophy altogether. Now, this is complemented by the German philosopher Lebanese. Now, Lebanese articulates that his philosophy is about the great rationalist principle, which is called the principle of sufficient reason, which states that everything exists because it has a sufficient reason for its existence. Right? Therefore, the human universe is rationally intelligible, that whatever exists has a rational principle, and that all the existence that is around us, all that is happening, will have a rationalist principle. This will later on be taken up by a sect of thinking called the deists. But what is important here is Leibniz's assertion that the entire universe is moving within a rational frame of thought. Now, obviously, you see, between Spinoza and Leibniz, you have a certain degree of, I will say, a certain degree of abstractions. But Locke is the philosopher with Newton who is pinning down knowledge to its empirical basis and suggesting that it is only experience, only and only experience that is leading towards knowledge through the exercise of reason. So from Descartes, we have the prioritization of reason, rationality, cogito, and the importance of a correct way and method of thinking. From Locke, we have the collapse of the innate idea and the idea that there is only inductive reasoning, right? And that all knowledge is formed through sense experience only. So sense as leading to knowledge and cognition. From Leibniz and Spinoza, we have ideas of either divinity within nature and the collapse of the mind and the matter dualism, or the principle of sufficient reason, where everything is seen as rational. I know these are difficult concepts to have. Maybe what you can do is take a look at Spinoza and Leibniz. I realize that we are not doing hardcore philosophy, and I cannot elaborate on this. I'll elaborate on Descartes and Locke, of course, but maybe you could check out these philosophies when you have a little bit of spare time. This is what I will call the rationalist phase of the Enlightenment. But then the question is, was the Enlightenment all about rationality? Now, in between, of course, we have a certain degree of skepticism involved here also. And you will remember your classes on Jonathan Swift. Swift, being the Dean of St. Patrick's, a clergyman, wrote Gulliver's Travels not as a travel text at all. It was neither about big men and small men. It was entirely about the questioning and the exploding of the claims of the Enlightenment. Think about the humanims, for example, whom we talked about, or think about the Lilliputs. When Gulliver sort of brings these Lilliputs from Blefuscu, the ships, what does the Lilliput king want? He wants power. And he wants Science and Gulliver to actually sort of eviscerate the land of Blefuscu. In the fourth book, Gulliver talks about rational horses called humanims. And even they are devoid of all emotions. And all they can think about is to completely eliminate the beastly Yahoo. So Swift is trying to show that rationality does not necessarily lead to ethical life. Rationality does not necessarily lead to an egalitarian society. That reason can also be can be yoked by power for its own requirements and can drive men into madness. Of course, Swift's position is very careful. He's a person of the clergy, and therefore, if you have observed, those of you who have read Gulliver's Travels carefully with me will have observed that Swift does not talk about religion at all. The one factor which is not there in Gulliver's Travels is religion. What he instead does is shows how empty the concept of the Enlightenment is, and how rationality does not necessarily lead to either happiness or justice or any kind of compassion. Of course, the great example of that is the book third of Gulliver's Travels, his visit to Laputa, where the Laputans, which constitutes of Laputa being the Spanish name for the whore, is where the flying island is used so that they can bully the people down on the earth, so that they can deny them sunlight if they do not obey. And of course, there's this entire satire on the Royal Academy in the academy which is described there, which engages in fruitless experiments. So Swift's text is that bridge, I think, where you can see how the ideas of rationality as solely an index to truth is questioned relentlessly. Now, the philosopher who does this in a very big way, in an alternative route, and this is where I'm coming to the second strand of the Enlightenment philosophers, is, of course, the philosopher Hume, David Hume. And enter Hume is, of course, part of the Scottish Enlightenment. What does Hume suggest? Hume suggests that, you see, Hume's text is a treatise of human nature, and this is 1740. And later on, he publishes Inquiries Concerning Human Understanding. This is 1748. Now, Hume asks this question: is rationality necessarily leading to truth? Right? Because different people have different ways of rationality. And therefore, rationality might be used by many ways, many people in many different ways. And therefore, instead of rationality as the sole index of truth, what Hume posits is the concept of sensibility. He says that if you are unhappy or if you are crying, I will feel sympathy for you, right? That is a natural human relationship. And this he calls the relationship which is based on sensibility, right? And because we have sensibility, he says, we also have sociability, right? If I did not think about you, if I had no sensation or no sympathy for you, we would have no society at all, right? So Hume suggests that there is a certain degree of sensibility. Please remember sensibility in the sense of feeling, right? Not sensibility in the terms of intelligence. Sensibility which leads us towards sociability. And it is through the practice of sensibility and sociability that we arrive at a rational society. Now, of course, some of it had already been circulated through the idea of sentiment and sympathy in the philosopher, the Earl of Shaftesbury, for example. And you had traces of this in the sentimental drama, right? And of course, Hume's idea is also taken up by a man whom you know essentially as a as an economist, but he was also a philosopher, Adam Smith. And Adam Smith published his theory of moral sentiments, where Smith suggests that it is sentiment that leads us towards morality rather than reason. Reason can lead us towards immorality also. Now, this is an argument that, for example, Adorno and Horkheimer make in the dialectic of the Enlightenment, where they show how, Hitler, for example, provided his own rationality for the extermination of the Jews. So rationality can be, perverted, but sentiment and sensibility are intrinsic to man and lead us towards truth and sociability. So one of the directions of the Enlightenment is this direction of fellow feeling, sympathy, and intense sociability. Now, you will see that this is the second tradition of Enlightenment thought that goes into the making of the pre-romantics, especially Gray. You have, for example, Collins talking about it. And you also have this idea being percolated into the philosophy of Blake, and later on, of course, Wordsworth. Right? Those of you who have read The Leech Gatherer, for example, Resolution and Independence, will remember this sympathy between the poet and the leech gatherer, and this identification with the simple way of living as a greater glimpse into truth. And those of you who will be reading the prelude later on will think about how, this intense bonding with nature and this intense sense of being and being with nature will provide a certain realization which is beyond the scope of the rational. Now, my point here is that, therefore, that if there is one direction of the Enlightenment which moves towards the championing of rationality as the only methodology of truth, as the only road to truth, then there is simultaneously another philosophy which talks about sentiment, sensibility, fellow feeling, sociability, the importance of identifying with the other, as it were. Now think about Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin. Think about how the question of slavery, therefore, comes up, and this is something which I will talk about. Briefly, let me allude to Raja Ram Mohan Roy's letter on Sati. Now, Raja Ram Mohan Roy takes two directions of the Enlightenment together. He, for the first part of the letter, talks about logic and how he tries to prove from the earlier Shastras that, Sati is something that is anti-rational, right? Irrational, right? And that it is not following even the dictums of our holy texts. But having said that, having demolished the argument through reason, he then asks about the widows, do you not feel pity for them? Right? Now, this concept of doya, sympathy, and intense fellow feeling as leading towards a larger truth, therefore glimpsing into the truth, and that there is a certain limit of rationality, is the second strand of the Enlightenment. And where do you locate this literature? You locate it in the sentimental drama. You locate it in novels, for example, of sentiment, right? For example, you have Richardson using the novel of sentiment to a large extent. You will have Henry Mackenzie. If you are interested, go home today and take a look at The Man of Feeling, right? And the way in which The Man of Feeling creates a structure of sociability through the intense sympathy that they have. And this will later on move towards also the figure of the romantic poet in many ways. Think about Shelley, for example. I know that you are, you cannot relate this. You've always been taught that romanticism is antithetical to the 18th century. It is not actually. It's a continuity in many ways. Think about Shelley, for example, as this man who falls upon the thorns of life and who bleeds. But it is because that he feels at one with the man that he can write Prometheus, right? And therefore, a lot of literature of the Enlightenment, which talks about slavery as being both logically irrational as well as identifies with the slave, as it were, and therefore creates a discourse where there are two routes which open up to knowledge. One, which predicates itself on reason, rationality in the mind only, and segregates the mind and the matter, and the other, which moves towards the truth through the exercise of the emotions and the sensibilities, as it were, right? Now, these are the two, I will say, concurrent philosophies that runs within the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment philosophy is not one body of literature. It is multiple bodies of literature. But obviously you will understand that there is an attempt, and this is seen within the Enlightenment philosophies, including Voltaire, including D'Alembert, including Diderot, and later on Rousseau, where this entire discourse is no longer about metaphysics, as it were, right? No longer about abstractions. It is about human nature, human society, and how that can be perfected. You see, all this entire literature that you will read, starting from, say, satire to the romantics, is about the intense exploration of the human self, not the divine one, right? Human nature and its perfection becomes the point of discourse, right? And that in itself, through its different directions, is the contribution of the Enlightenment. And of course, a relentless re-examination, even when Hume is skeptically dismissing rationality, he's not suggesting that it can be done through any divine intervention, suggesting that it can be done only through human emotions, right? And therefore, even a philosopher like Hume, who talks about sympathy, is also extremely almost atheist in his perception. And this is also related with, I will say, that the philosophy of the Enlightenment, where the philosophers are trying to bring together these different strands into this grand book of the encyclopedia, which is, as it were, a repository of all human knowledge, that has a very strong political compulsion in the way that human societies can be transformed. So the discourse of the interface between philosophy and politics within the Enlightenment is very powerful. If philosophy is opening up the human mind to questioning dogma and freeing the mind, then that philosophy is also provoking the thinkers to dream about a society, a political society that is free from tyranny and that opens itself up to the human subjects, right? Therefore, the freedom from chains, the freedom from dogma, is a lingering metaphor of Enlightenment thought. This brings me to my final philosopher, of course, and that is Immanuel Kant. Now, Immanuel Kant, of course, talks about the critique of pure reason, and he will try and bridge the two philosophies, as it were, and suggests that, this concept of pure reason is an anathema, and that it is also emotions, sentiments that will go into the making of it, and the different routes towards a priori and post priori knowledge. Now, these are all very dense philosophical terms. I will not go into that. What I'll go into is this last text that we'll have to read in some detail. And that is, what is the Enlightenment? That's a question which was given to Kant, and he answered. And he said that, it is man's freedom from his self-incurred tutelage, right? That we have submitted to dogma ourselves. And that this questioning spirit, right, the self-incurred tutelage, we have surrendered to this body, and we will now question. And we will not question individually. So if X, as I can see, Shorab is questioning the dogmatic knowledge, it does not lead to enlightenment. Enlightenment is achieved only and only when there is a public use of reason. And the motto of the Enlightenment will be sapere aude, or dare to know, right? Therefore, I return you back to the concept that, Descartes suggested, that the first step that the Enlightenment took was to doubt, right? And the last word that, as it were, Kant has is dare. So doubt and dare. And this question which is thrown to Kant, and he says, has, human society reached the Enlightenment? He says, no, it never will, right? Kant, of course, does not say never will. But Kant suggests that it is in a process. And it is this process that the Enlightenment philosophy is about. How does one transform human society? How does one attain human knowledge? And the Enlightenment's answer is doubt, validate, experiment, empathize. And it is only in this process, in these two directions, that you will somewhere arrive at a better truth, or let's not say better truth, at a better society and a closer glimpse about human nature. And therefore, 1670 is the date of Descartes, 1784 is the date of Kant's essay. Now, within a century, what I'm trying to suggest is that the way of looking at truth and knowledge has undergone a profound transformation. That God, innate ideas have been taken out. Man and his doubts, his ideas, his mind is now the thesis of rationality. His emotions are also brought into the equation, and it is human society that this knowledge system is trying to transform. So newer discoveries in science, newer political systems, newer economic systems, and human welfare, the rigorous and relentless study of man becomes the subject of Enlightenment philosophy. As Pope says, the proper study of mankind is man. That then is what the Enlightenment philosophy looked at. And it is with that that I will close this recording. In our next discussion, we'll take a closer look at how the political systems of the Enlightenment were in a process of churning. Right. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will stop the recording now.